The field telephone crackled to life at 9:30 on an October evening in 1942. 3,000 yards south of Henderson Field, on a darkened ridge where visibility ended at your fingertips, Sergeant Ralph Briggs gripped the receiver with both hands. On the opposite end of that fragile connection sat the command post of the 7th Marine Regiment's 1st Battalion, where Lieutenant Colonel Louis B. Chesty Puller waited for news no commander wants to hear. Briggs and 46 fellow Marines had pushed forward hours earlier, a lonely observation point meant to serve as the tripwire for what everyone knew was inevitable. The Japanese were coming. The only questions were when, where, and in what numbers. They'd spent the evening motionless in complete darkness, straining their senses against a night so black that clouds smothered even the faintest starlight. Intermittent downpours had drenched them to the bone, transforming the jungle floor into a slick morass. Even at this late hour, the humidity pressed down like a physical weight. Every noise, whether rustling foliage, nocturnal bird calls, or the low rumble of distant guns, seemed amplified tenfold in the consuming darkness. Then something changed. Voices drifted through the trees, Japanese voices, not a patrol or a scouting party, but the unmistakable sound of thousands of men on the move. What Briggs said next would determine whether those defending Henderson Field lived to see morning. "Colonel, there's about 3,000 Japs between you and me." Puller needed confirmation. Was he absolutely certain? "Positive. They've been all around us, singing and smoking cigarettes, heading your way." That single transmission bought Puller's battalion perhaps 30 minutes. 30 minutes before 3,000 soldiers from Japan's elite Sendai Division would slam into the southern defensive perimeter. 30 minutes to ready weapons, redistribute bullets, summon artillery coordinates, and brace for the storm about to break against their lines. 30 minutes before Henderson Field faced the fight that would determine its fate. 11,000 Marines and freshly deployed Army personnel formed a defensive ring around Henderson Field. Against them, 20,000 Japanese soldiers occupied Guadalcanal, and their commanding officer, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, had spent the previous 2 weeks orchestrating what he believed would be the Pacific War's defining engagement. Standing directly in the path of this approaching human tsunami were 2 sections of heavy machine guns under the command of a 26-year-old sergeant named John Basilone. He'd arrived on Guadalcanal 5 weeks earlier, on September 18th, when the 7th Marine Regiment came ashore. His responsibility was straightforward in concept, nearly impossible in execution: hold the line. The challenge Basilone confronted wasn't simple mathematics, though the numbers alone were sobering. The Japanese possessed numerical advantage, forward momentum, and a battle plan built on the assumption that American resolve would shatter under pressure. The Sendai Division represented one of Japan's finest infantry units. Men drawn primarily from Miyagi Prefecture on Honshu, veterans of campaigns in Manchuria and Java. They were seasoned, disciplined, and utterly convinced that Henderson Field would be theirs before sunrise. John Basilone came from Raritan, New Jersey, the son of Italian immigrants trying to build something permanent in America. His father, Salvatore, had left Caltanissetta in southern Italy in 1903, eventually settling in Raritan, where he worked his trade as a tailor. His mother, Dora Bensivenga, was American-born, though her parents had emigrated from that same Italian region. John was the 6th of 10 children raised in a working-class neighborhood where everyone knew their neighbor's business. His formal education ended with 8th grade at St. Bernard Parochial School. He was 15 when he walked away from academics. For a while he carried golf bags at the local country club, pocketing tips and watching wealthy men play a game he'd never take up himself. But civilian life felt incomplete, purposeless. At 17, in July 1934, he enlisted in the Army. They assigned him to the 16th Infantry at Fort Jay, then transferred him to the 31st Infantry Regiment. His 3-year enlistment took him to the Philippines, where he was stationed in Manila. There, he discovered he had a talent for boxing, dominating the regimental competitions and earning the nickname that would follow him forever, Manila John. When his service obligation ended in 1937, Basilone returned stateside and found work driving trucks in Reisterstown, Maryland. The pay was reliable, the work steady, but something fundamental was missing. He missed the structure, the brotherhood, the clear sense of mission that military service provided. By 1940, he'd made his decision. He was going back, and this time he wanted to return to the Philippines faster than the Army could get him there. His solution was the Marine Corps. On June 3, 1940, he enlisted in Baltimore. After surviving Parris Island's boot camp and completing additional training at Quantico and New River, the Marines recognized what they had: a soldier with prior service and genuine expertise in weapons systems. They made him an instructor, but Basilone pushed for assignment to a combat unit. He got his wish: D Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, as a machine gun section leader. Those years in the Army had made him one of the battalion's most knowledgeable machine gunners. The M1917, A1 water-cooled heavy machine gun, was a sophisticated weapon demanding proper handling, constant maintenance, and tactical expertise. Basilone understood it intimately: every mechanism, every quirk, every capability. The Marines holding Guadalcanal were running on fumes. They'd been in continuous combat since August 7th, when the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore and seized the partially completed Japanese airstrip. The invasion had been rushed. Admiral Ernest J. King, commanding the U.S. fleet, had accelerated the timeline dramatically when radio intelligence revealed Japanese construction of an airbase on Guadalcanal. If that airfield became operational, it would threaten every Allied supply convoy to Australia and New Zealand. King pushed Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall to authorize Operation Watchtower immediately. Major General Alexander Vandegrift's 1st Marine Division would take Guadalcanal, ready or not. The division was packed with fresh recruits, mostly teenagers who'd signed up after Pearl Harbor, with minimal training and zero combat experience. But they were available, so they went. The August 7th landing met surprisingly light resistance. Marines who'd steeled themselves for brutal opposition instead found that most Japanese defenders had vanished into the jungle. By the following evening, they'd secured the unfinished airfield and the surrounding territory. Using captured Japanese construction equipment, they finished the runway and christened it Henderson Field, honoring Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who died at Midway. For 10 weeks, the Japanese had been trying to take it back. Their reinforcement method, which Marines dubbed the Tokyo Express, involved racing destroyers and cruisers down the Slot, the channel between the Solomon Islands, at night, offloading troops and supplies on Guadalcanal's beaches, then racing back north before American aircraft could catch them at dawn. The system worked, to a point. The Tokyo Express could deliver personnel and light equipment, but not the heavy artillery, vehicles, and bulk supplies a major offensive required. Japanese soldiers arrived with their rifles and basic gear. Everything else had to be hand-carried through the jungle. Still, the reinforcements kept coming. In August, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki landed with roughly 900 men from the 28th Infantry Regiment. They attacked on August 21st at Alligator Creek and were virtually annihilated by Marine firepower. Only a few dozen survived. In September, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi arrived with approximately 6,000 men. They struck on September 12th and 13th at what Marines later named Edson's Ridge. The 2-day battle ended with the Japanese repulsed and their casualties catastrophic. By mid-October, the Japanese had absorbed these costly lessons and were preparing something far more substantial. By mid-October, the Japanese had accumulated sufficient force for a massive offensive. General Hyakutake had relocated his 17th Army headquarters forward from Rabaul. He'd positioned heavy artillery, 100mm cannons and 150mm howitzers, though getting them into place had required Herculean effort. The guns had been disassembled, loaded onto destroyers, transported down the Slot, unloaded on beaches, then carried piece by piece through the jungle to firing positions. The logistics alone consumed weeks. They'd also brought tanks. On October 14th, the battleships Congo and Haruna unleashed nearly 1,000 14-inch shells on Henderson Field over 90 minutes, the most intense bombardment American forces had yet endured. Marines huddled in foxholes and bunkers while the shells obliterated aircraft, buildings, and fuel dumps. The airfield was temporarily knocked offline. Japanese transport ships exploited the reduced air threat, landing over 4,000 additional troops and heavy equipment, including those 150-millimeter howitzers.
On October 22nd, Hayakutake addressed his officers with absolute confidence. The time of the decisive battle between Japan and the United States has come. He was so certain of victory that he ordered preparations for an elaborate surrender ceremony on Henderson Field, something impressive enough to resonate throughout the entire Japanese military. In Tokyo, military leadership watched closely. They believed Guadalcanal would be the Pacific War's turning point. If Japan could recapture Henderson Field and eject the Americans from the island, it would prove the United States lacked the stamina for a prolonged Pacific campaign. Japanese high command believed American morale was fragile, that a significant defeat would force Washington to negotiate a settlement leaving Japan's Pacific conquests intact. Emperor Hirohito himself received briefings on the Guadalcanal operation. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The plan called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions. A diversionary force would strike across the Matanikau River on the perimeter's western side, pulling American attention and reserves in that direction. The main assault would come from the south, where Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama would lead the Sendai Division through the jungle and hammer the American lines near the Lunga River. The terrain south of Henderson Field ranked among Guadalcanal's worst: dense jungle, steep ravines, deep mud, rivers and streams cutting through hills and ridges. Starting October 12th, Japanese engineers had hacked through 15 miles of jungle to create the Maruyama Road. Between October 16th and 18th, the Sendai Division began its approach march. Each soldier carried his rifle, ammunition, pack, and one artillery shell for the mountain guns being manhandled through the wilderness. Conditions were punishing. Rain transformed the trail into a mud river. Soldiers carrying heavy loads slipped and fell repeatedly. Artillery pieces had to be disassembled and carried in sections. Progress lagged far behind schedule. When Maruyama's units reached their attack positions, he believed they were 4 miles south of Henderson Field. They were actually 8 miles out. The Japanese held complete contempt for the Marines and conducted zero reconnaissance of American defenses. Their plan was simple: march forward until hitting American lines, then roll over them and seize the airfield. The attack was scheduled for October 22nd, then postponed to the 23rd, then delayed again to the 24th. The October 23rd diversionary attack went catastrophically wrong. 2 Japanese regiments attempted to cross the Matanikau River behind 9 tanks. Marine artillery had the crossing pre-sighted. They fired over 6,000 rounds before Japanese infantry could even reach the river. The tanks made it partway across the shallow water before 37-millimeter anti-tank guns destroyed them. During lulls in the artillery fire, Marines could hear Japanese soldiers screaming. Patrols the next morning counted approximately 600 dead Japanese in the area. The attack failed completely, but it did accomplish its purpose. Marine commanders shifted units toward the Matanikau, believing that's where the main assault would come. The southern sector, where Basilone's guns were positioned, was thinly defended. Lieutenant Colonel Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, was responsible for a sector originally designed for an entire regiment. Puller had roughly 1,000 Marines spread along 1,500 yards of defensive line. The terrain helped. The sector anchored on a ridge later nicknamed Coffin Corner. Dense jungle approached the ridge from the south. Marines had cut fields of fire through the vegetation and strung barbed wire. They dug foxholes and machine gun positions, but the front was long and Puller lacked the manpower to defend it in depth. Basilone commanded 2 sections of M1917A1 heavy machine guns, water-cooled .30 caliber weapons that were reliable and devastating when employed correctly. Each gun required at least 3 crew members, a gunner, an assistant gunner, and an ammunition bearer. The weapons were heavy, about 100 pounds, with water jacket filled and mounted on tripods. They could fire 500 rounds per minute and maintain sustained fire as long as ammunition and water held out. Basilone had positioned his 6 guns to cover the most probable avenues of approach. Crews had dug shallow pits for the guns and stacked sandbags around them for protection. They'd cleared firing lanes and registered the ranges. Ammunition cans were stockpiled near each position. Water jackets were filled from canteens and water cans. They were as prepared as possible. But many of Basilone's men were sick. Malaria was endemic on Guadalcanal. Men fought with fevers, chills, and exhaustion. Some could barely stand. They remained at their positions because no replacements existed. Food was limited. Supplies arrived by ship when the Japanese Navy permitted it, which wasn't often. Marines ate captured Japanese rice, canned rations, and whatever they could scavenge. They were hungry, tired, and sick. But they were Marines, and they would hold their positions until ordered otherwise, or until they died. When Sergeant Briggs's warning came through at 9:30, Puller immediately alerted his battalion. He called for artillery support and requested reinforcements from the newly arrived Army 164th Infantry Regiment. But the Army troops were green, just arrived on the island, unfamiliar with the terrain. Getting them into position would take time. Basilone received the warning and passed it to his gun crews. Check weapons, ensure ammunition is ready, fill water jackets, clear fields of fire, then wait. The jungle south of the ridge was utterly black. No moon, heavy cloud cover, occasional rain squalls. The darkness was so absolute that a man couldn't see his hand before his face. The Marines listened. They heard movement in the jungle, voices speaking Japanese, the clink of equipment. The sounds grew louder, closer. Then came singing, Japanese soldiers singing as they moved through the jungle toward American lines. They made no attempt at noise discipline. They believed the Americans would break and run at first contact. The singing stopped. The night went silent except for rain and jungle sounds. Then the artillery started. Japanese mountain guns and mortars opened fire on the ridge. Shells crashed into Marine positions. Explosions lit up the night in brief, terrible flashes. Shrapnel whined through the air. Men screamed when hit. The barrage lasted 30 minutes, heavy but not overwhelming. The Japanese had struggled to move their artillery through the jungle and had limited ammunition. When the barrage lifted, the infantry assault began. The Japanese emerged from darkness in waves, hundreds of men screaming "Banzai" and charging up the ridge toward Marine positions. Basilone opened fire. 6 heavy machine guns hammered out rounds. Tracers arced through darkness. The sound was deafening. The guns fired in long, sustained bursts, sweeping across the fields of fire. Japanese soldiers ran straight into a wall of fire. Men fell in clusters. The lead ranks collapsed. Those behind stumbled over bodies and kept coming. The machine guns never stopped firing. Basilone moved from gun to gun, directing fire, helping crews clear jams, bringing up ammunition. His hands moved automatically, trained by years of practice. He'd learned machine gunnery in the Army and had trained Marines in its use. He knew the weapon better than anyone in the battalion. The first wave broke. The Japanese pulled back into the jungle, regrouped, and came again. The second wave was larger, better organized. They threw grenades as they advanced. Mortar rounds fell among Marine positions. One of Basilone's gun crews took a direct hit. The gun was destroyed. 3 men killed instantly. Basilone grabbed the spare gun, dragged it to a new position, set it up, and opened fire. The gun was hot. The barrel glowed red in darkness. Steam rose from the water jacket. Basilone fired anyway, burning his hands on the metal, ignoring the pain. The second wave broke. The Japanese pulled back again. Basilone assessed his situation. 2 of his 6 guns were destroyed. Several crew members were dead or wounded. Ammunition was running low. The remaining crews were exhausted. Some were wounded and still fighting. Others were sick with malaria and shaking with fever. But they held their positions. The Japanese came a third time. This wave hit multiple points along the defensive line simultaneously. They were trying to find a weak spot, a gap they could exploit. Basilone's sector took the heaviest pressure. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged the ridge. The machine guns opened fire again, but ammunition was becoming critical. Crews were burning through belts faster than they could reload. Basilone realized they would run out of ammunition before dawn. If they ran out, the Japanese would overrun the position and reach Henderson Field. Without the machine guns, nothing stood between the Japanese and the airfield except a few exhausted Marines with rifles.
Basilone made a decision that violated every tactical principle in the Marine Corps manual. He left his position in the middle of a firefight and ran back through the jungle to retrieve more ammunition. The nearest ammunition dump sat approximately 150 yards behind the front line. Basilone ran through darkness, carrying his .45 caliber pistol. Japanese infiltrators were everywhere. Small groups had penetrated the lines and were moving behind Marine positions. Basilone could hear them in the jungle, could hear them firing at Marines in their foxholes. He kept running. He reached the ammunition dump, loaded himself with as many belts and cans as he could carry, and ran back. The weight was staggering. Approximately 90 pounds of machine gun ammunition, belts draped over his shoulders, cans clutched in both hands. He ran through darkness, through mud, through Japanese infiltrators. He made it back to his guns and distributed the ammunition. The crews reloaded and continued firing. Basilone made that run 3 more times during the night, each time carrying 90 pounds of ammunition through enemy-held jungle, each time making it back alive, each time keeping his guns firing. On the second run, he encountered a group of Japanese soldiers who had infiltrated behind the lines. They were crouched near a fallen log, attempting to work their way toward the Marine command post. Basilone saw them in a brief flash of artillery fire. He dropped the ammunition he was carrying, drew his .45 caliber pistol, and fired. The range was close, maybe 15 feet. He killed 3 Japanese soldiers before the others scattered into darkness. He retrieved the ammunition and continued his run to the gun positions. On the third run, Japanese mortar fire was falling along the trail he was using. He could hear the shells coming, that distinctive whistle as they arced through the night sky. He threw himself flat each time he heard one coming, pressed his face into mud, felt the concussion as the shell exploded nearby. Shrapnel whined overhead. When the explosion faded, he got up and kept running. The weight of the ammunition made him slow, made him an easy target, but stopping wasn't an option. His Marines needed ammunition. Without it, they would die, and the position would be overrun. On the fourth run, he was so exhausted he could barely stand. His legs shook, his hands trembled, his vision blurred. He hadn't slept in over 30 hours. He hadn't eaten in over 12 hours. He was operating on adrenaline and willpower, but he made the run, delivered the ammunition, and returned to his guns. Around midnight, another gun was destroyed by a grenade. Basilone was moving to replace it when he saw a new problem. Japanese dead were piling up in front of Marine positions. The bodies were stacked so high they were blocking fields of fire. The machine guns couldn't depress low enough to hit Japanese soldiers advancing behind the piles of corpses. Basilone called for volunteers. Several Marines crawled out of their positions and dragged Japanese bodies out of the way, clearing the fields of fire. They did this under fire, with Japanese soldiers shooting at them from less than 50 yards away. They cleared enough space for the guns to resume effective fire. The battle continued. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged the ridge. The machine guns cut them down. The Japanese kept coming. They were brave, determined, committed to taking Henderson Field. They believed their emperor had ordered it, and they would die trying. The Marines were equally determined. They had taken Henderson Field in August, and they would not give it up. Around 2 a.m., Army reinforcements from the 164th Infantry Regiment arrived. They moved into positions behind Puller's Marines, adding depth to the defense. The Japanese attack continued. Around 3 a.m., Basilone's gun positions ran out of water. The water jackets had boiled dry from sustained firing. Without water, the barrels would overheat and warp, rendering the guns useless. Basilone and his crews urinated into the water jackets to keep the guns cool. It was disgusting and desperate, but it worked. The guns kept firing. By 4 a.m., the Japanese attacks were becoming less organized. The waves were smaller, the charges less coordinated. The Sendai Division was being bled to death on the ridge. At dawn, the attacks stopped. The Japanese withdrew into the jungle. The Marines held their positions and waited. The scene in front of Basilone's guns was horrific. Japanese dead covered the ridge. Hundreds of bodies lay where they had fallen. Some were piled 3 and 4 deep. The smell was overwhelming: blood, cordite, death. Basilone and his surviving crew members sat among their guns, exhausted, covered in mud and blood, many wounded, all sick. But they had held. Henderson Field was still in American hands. Puller came forward to assess the situation. He walked through the killing ground and counted bodies. Later estimates put Japanese dead in front of Basilone's sector at nearly 1,000. Basilone was credited with personally killing at least 38 enemy soldiers, many at close range with his pistol when machine guns were being reloaded or repositioned. Of the 16 men in Basilone's 2 machine gun sections, only he and 2 others survived the night unwounded. The rest were dead or seriously wounded. The Japanese tried again on the night of October 25th. This time the Marines were reinforced and ready. Puller's battalion, now supported by Army troops, repelled every attack. The Japanese lost another 300 men. At dawn on October 26th, General Hyakutake called off the offensive. His Sendai Division had been destroyed as an effective fighting force. More than 1,500 of Maruyama's soldiers were dead. Another 1,000 were wounded or missing. The survivors retreated into the jungle, starving and diseased. The offensive had failed completely. The Marines lost approximately 60 killed in the 2-day battle. Most of those deaths occurred in sectors other than Basilone's. Where Basilone's guns had been positioned, the Japanese breakthrough never happened. But the cost had been terrible. The aftermath revealed the scale of Japanese commitment and the brutality of the fighting. Marine patrols found Japanese soldiers who had been carrying personal belongings wrapped in cloth, family photographs, letters from home. They had expected to die on Guadalcanal. Many had written farewell letters before the attack. They believed they were sacrificing themselves for their emperor and their nation. One Marine patrol found a Japanese officer's diary. The entries described the march through the jungle, the difficulty of the terrain, the shortage of food and water. The last entry, written hours before the attack, said the officer was proud to die for the emperor and hoped his death would contribute to Japan's final victory. He asked that his family be notified he had died honorably in battle. Another patrol found letters from Japanese soldiers' families, mothers writing to sons, wives writing to husbands, children writing to fathers. The letters spoke of pride in their service, hopes for their safe return, descriptions of life back home. The Marines who found these letters were struck by how similar they were to their own letters from home. The enemy they were killing were not faceless monsters. They were men with families, hopes, and fears, fighting for their country just as the Marines were fighting for theirs. But understanding that didn't change the reality of combat. The Japanese had attacked with intent to kill every Marine on the ridge and take Henderson Field. The Marines had defended with intent to stop them. Both sides fought with everything they had. One side won, the other lost. That was the nature of war. The American victory at Henderson Field marked the Guadalcanal campaign's turning point. Before the battle, the campaign's outcome was uncertain. The Japanese had numerical superiority on the island, more troops, more artillery, and seemingly endless willingness to send reinforcements. After the battle, momentum shifted decisively to the Americans. The Japanese had committed their best troops and heaviest firepower to the October offensive. When that offensive failed, they had nothing left to try. The Sendai Division, considered an elite formation of the Japanese army, had been effectively destroyed. Its regiments were shattered, its battalions at half strength or less. Its soldiers were starving, diseased, and demoralized. The division retreated into the jungle and spent the following weeks trying to survive rather than fight. The Japanese Navy attempted to deliver reinforcements in November during the naval battle of Guadalcanal, but American naval forces intercepted and destroyed most of the convoy. Japan lost 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, 3 destroyers, and 11 transport ships. Thousands of Japanese reinforcements drowned or were killed before reaching shore. After that defeat, Japanese High Command accepted that Henderson Field could not be retaken. They began planning to evacuate their forces from Guadalcanal. The evacuation, called Operation KE, took place between January and February 1943. Approximately 11,000 Japanese soldiers were successfully evacuated. Another 14,000 had died on the island from combat, starvation, and disease. For his actions on the nights of October 24th and 25th, John Basilone was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation read that while the enemy was hammering at Marine defensive positions, Sergeant Basilone, in charge of 2 sections of heavy machine guns, fought valiantly to check the savage and determined assault. In a fierce frontal attack with the Japanese blasting his guns with grenades and mortar fire, one of Sergeant Basilone's sections with its gun crews was put out of action, leaving only 2 men able to carry on. Moving an extra gun into position, he placed it in action, then under continual fire, repaired another and personally manned it, gallantly holding his line until replacements arrived. The citation concluded that his great personal valor and courageous initiative were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. Basilone received the medal on May 21, 1943, at a ceremony in Australia. He was the first enlisted Marine to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. After receiving the medal, Basilone said, "Only part of this medal belongs to me. Pieces of it belong to the boys who are still on Guadalcanal. It was rough as hell down there." The Marine Corps brought Basilone back to the United States for war bond tours. He traveled the country, appearing at rallies, meeting civilians, selling bonds to fund the war effort. He was celebrated as a hero, featured in newsreels, interviewed by reporters. His hometown of Raritan held a parade in his honor. But Basilone didn't want to be a celebrity. He wanted to return to combat. He repeatedly requested orders back to the Pacific. The Marine Corps refused. They needed him for war bonds and morale. He was more valuable as a symbol than as a fighting Marine. In late 1943, Basilone was assigned as a machine gunnery instructor at Camp Pendleton in California. While there, he met Lena May Riggy, a sergeant in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. They married in July 1944. Finally, in late 1944, Basilone received orders to return to the Pacific. He was assigned to C Company, 1st Battalion, 27th Marines, 5th Marine Division. The division was training for the invasion of Iwo Jima. On February 19, 1945, Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone landed on Red Beach on Iwo Jima with the first assault wave. The Japanese had fortified the island with thousands of gun positions, bunkers, and tunnels. The beaches were mined and covered by interlocking fields of fire. The first day of the battle was a nightmare. Marines landed under heavy fire and struggled to move inland. Basilone led his machine gun section off the beach and toward their objectives. He encountered a Japanese blockhouse that was pinning down Marines on the beach. The blockhouse was heavily fortified with thick concrete walls and firing slits. Basilone attacked it alone. He worked his way around to the top of the blockhouse, exposed to enemy fire from multiple directions. He dropped grenades and demolition charges through the gun ports. The explosions destroyed the blockhouse and killed the entire Japanese crew. With the blockhouse eliminated, Marines could advance off the beach. Basilone then guided a trapped Marine tank out of a minefield. The tank had driven into a buried mine pit and was stuck, unable to move, taking fire from Japanese positions. Basilone walked in front of the tank, exposed to enemy fire, directing the driver through the minefield to safe ground. The tank was saved and continued supporting the infantry advance. Minutes after clearing the tank from the minefield, John Basilone was killed by a Japanese mortar shell. He was 28 years old. He had been on Iwo Jima for less than 3 hours. For his actions on Iwo Jima, Basilone was awarded the Navy Cross posthumously. The citation read that he displayed great personal valor and courageous initiative and concluded that his actions helped Marines break through Japanese defenses during the critical early hours of the invasion. John Basilone became the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. His body was returned to the United States and buried in Arlington National Cemetery. His widow, Lena, never remarried. She wore her wedding ring until her death in 1999. In Raritan, New Jersey, a parade is held every year in Basilone's honor. A statue of him stands in the town, depicting him cradling his water-cooled .30 caliber machine gun just as he did on the night of October 24th, 1942. A Navy destroyer escort, USS Basilone, was named in his honor. The ship served from 1949 until 1977. In 2010, HBO released a miniseries called The Pacific that depicted Basilone's service at Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima. Private First Class Nash W. Phillips, who fought with Basilone on Guadalcanal, later recalled what he saw that night. Basilone had a machine gun on the go for 3 days and nights without sleep, rest, or food. He was barefooted and his eyes were red as fire. His face was dirty black from gunfire and lack of sleep. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to his shoulders. He had a .45 tucked into the waistband of his trousers. He just stopped by to see how I was making out, me and the others in the section. I'll never forget him. He'll never be dead in my mind. Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller, who commanded the battalion that night, later reported that nearly 1,000 enemy dead lay in front of his positions, with several hundred more between the American lines and the wire. What the Japanese failed to understand was the nature of the men they were fighting. The American Marines on Guadalcanal were not the soft, undisciplined troops Japanese propaganda claimed they were. Japanese military doctrine in 1942 was heavily influenced by Bushido, the warrior code emphasizing spirit over material. Japanese training taught soldiers that superior fighting spirit could overcome enemy firepower. This belief had served Japan well in its war against China, where Japanese troops often defeated larger Chinese forces through aggressive tactics and willingness to accept casualties. But the Americans were not the Chinese. American military doctrine emphasized firepower, combined arms, and defensive positions. American training taught Marines to use cover, coordinate supporting fires, and employ weapons with maximum effect. When Japanese infantry charged American defensive positions, they weren't facing demoralized Chinese troops. They were facing well-trained Marines with machine guns, mortars, and artillery support. The Japanese belief in spiritual superiority led them to consistently underestimate American military capability. Before the Guadalcanal campaign, Japanese intelligence estimated American strength on the island at 2,000 troops. The actual number was over 11,000. Japanese commanders assumed Marines would break and run when faced with determined attacks. Instead, Marines held their positions and fought back. Japanese soldiers were taught that Americans valued their own lives too highly to stand and die. The night of October 24th proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. The Sendai Division had expected to march through Marine positions and seize the airfield with minimal resistance. What happened instead was that they discovered American Marines would not only stand and fight, but would continue fighting under conditions that should have caused any reasonable person to retreat. Basilone's gun crews held their positions even when outnumbered 20-1. They held when their guns were being destroyed by grenades and mortars. They held when they were running out of ammunition. They held when they were wounded and sick. They held because they were Marines, and Marines don't abandon their positions. This was a fundamental cultural shock for Japanese commanders. In Japanese military tradition, if an attack failed, it was because the attacking troops lacked sufficient fighting spirit. After the Battle of Henderson Field, Japanese commanders had to grapple with a different reality. Their troops had shown maximum fighting spirit. They had charged enemy positions repeatedly despite horrific casualties. They had been willing to die to achieve their objective, and they had failed anyway, not because they lacked spirit, but because they had run into an enemy with superior firepower, better defensive positions, and equal determination. Japanese military leadership struggled to adapt to this new reality. They had built an entire military doctrine around the concept of superior fighting spirit overcoming material disadvantages. When that doctrine failed at Guadalcanal, they had no alternative strategy to fall back on. They couldn't match American industrial production. They couldn't replace losses as quickly as the Americans could. They couldn't supply their forces as effectively as the Americans could. All they had was fighting spirit, and Guadalcanal proved that wasn't enough. For the Marines who survived, the memory of that night never faded. They had faced an enemy who outnumbered them 3-1, who was willing to die to reach their objective, who charged again and again despite horrific casualties, and they had held. They held because of courage, training, discipline, and determination. They held because men like John Basilone refused to abandon their positions or their fellow Marines. They held because giving up was not an option.
The Battle of Henderson Field became a defining moment in the Pacific War. It proved American forces could stand and fight against determined Japanese attacks. It proved firepower and defensive positions could defeat mass infantry assaults. It proved Marines would hold their ground no matter the cost. But more than that, it marked a psychological turning point. Before Guadalcanal, Japanese military commanders believed they were facing an enemy that could be broken through aggressive tactics and superior fighting spirit. After Guadalcanal, they understood they were facing an enemy that would not break, that had industrial superiority, and that was willing to fight as long as necessary to win. This realization changed Japanese strategic planning for the rest of the war. After Henderson Field, Japanese commanders shifted from offensive operations aimed at destroying American forces to defensive operations aimed at making the war so costly that America would negotiate a peace settlement. This defensive strategy failed because it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of American national character. The Japanese believed Americans would grow tired of the war and demand peace. Instead, the American response to casualties was to produce more weapons, train more soldiers, and fight harder. Every Japanese defensive position that inflicted heavy casualties on attacking Americans simply ensured the next attack would be supported by even more firepower. The Battle of Henderson Field demonstrated this pattern in microcosm. The Japanese threw everything they had at Marine positions, inflicted significant casualties, and still lost. The American response wasn't to withdraw or negotiate, it was to reinforce the Marines, bring in Army troops, and hold the position at all costs. Japanese commanders who had studied American history shouldn't have been surprised by this response. Americans had demonstrated in their own Civil War that they were willing to sustain enormous casualties to achieve victory. The Union Army in 1864 and 1865 suffered casualty rates that would have broken most nations. But the Union kept fighting, kept sending more troops, kept attacking until the Confederacy collapsed. The same pattern repeated in World War I, when American forces took heavy casualties but kept attacking until Germany surrendered. Japanese military leaders either didn't understand this aspect of American character or didn't believe it applied to a war in the Pacific. Guadalcanal taught them otherwise. John Basilone's story became legendary in the Marine Corps. His name is taught to every Marine recruit. His actions are studied in military academies. His legacy lives on in the Corps he served, but Basilone never sought glory or recognition. When asked about his actions, he consistently deflected credit to the Marines he fought with. He believed he had simply done his job, nothing more. The truth is that his job on that night was impossible. Holding a 1,500-yard defensive line with 1,000 Marines against 3,000 attacking Japanese soldiers shouldn't have been possible. But Basilone and the men of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, made it possible. They held because there was no other option. They fought because that's what Marines do. And they won because men like John Basilone refused to accept defeat. In the years since the war, historians have analyzed the battle and debated why the Japanese offensive failed. Some credit American firepower, specifically the effectiveness of the M1917A1 machine gun in defensive positions. Others point to Japanese tactical errors, including the failure to conduct proper reconnaissance, the decision to attack at night through difficult terrain, and the reliance on frontal assaults against prepared positions. Still others note the difficult terrain and supply problems that prevented the Japanese from bringing their full strength to bear at the critical point. All these factors played a role. The M1917A1 machine gun, when properly employed, could fire 500 rounds per minute with effective range out to 1,500 yards. A single gun with sufficient ammunition could stop an infantry company in its tracks. Basilone's 6 guns, firing overlapping fields of fire, created a killing zone that no infantry force could cross. Tactical factors mattered too. Puller had positioned his battalion on defensible terrain, with good fields of fire. The Marines had dug in, established clear lanes of fire, and registered their supporting artillery. When the Japanese attacked, they were advancing uphill at night through jungle against an enemy that knew exactly where they were coming from. Strategic factors were decisive. The Japanese needed to take Henderson Field to win the Guadalcanal campaign. The Marines needed to hold Henderson Field to keep the Allies in the Solomon Islands. For the Japanese, losing the battle meant losing momentum and ultimately losing the campaign. For the Marines, losing the battle meant losing the airfield and potentially being driven off the island. Both sides understood the stakes, but ultimately the battle came down to individual Marines at individual defensive positions, making the decision to hold or fall back. At Basilone's position, that decision was never in doubt. He and his remaining crew members fought until they physically couldn't continue. They didn't retreat when they were outnumbered. They didn't retreat when their positions were being hit by grenades and mortars. They didn't retreat when they ran out of water for the gun jackets. They held because that's what Marines do. Other sections of the defensive line told similar stories. Earlier in the campaign, on August 21st, Private First Class Al Schmid had demonstrated the same determination at the Battle of Tanaru River. When his machine gunner was killed and his gun commander wounded, Schmid took over the weapon. Even after a grenade explosion blinded him, he continued firing based on voice directions from Corporal Leroy Diamond until reinforcements arrived. More than 200 Japanese dead were counted in front of his position. Schmid received the Navy Cross for his actions. Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Page, commanding a machine gun section in another part of the line, held his position through multiple Japanese attacks. On October 26th, when all his gun crews were killed or wounded, Page manned one of the guns alone, firing it from the hip while moving along the ridge to cover multiple firing positions. He received the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. These men and dozens of others whose names were never recorded in official reports held the line on Guadalcanal. They were the reason Henderson Field remained in American hands. They were the reason the Japanese offensive failed. They were the reason the United States maintained its foothold in the Solomon Islands and eventually pushed north toward Rabaul and the Japanese home islands. That's the story of how one Marine held off an entire Japanese night assault, not entirely alone because he had 15 men in his 2 machine gun sections. But by the end of the first night, only 3 of those 16 men were still standing, and John Basilone was one of them. If this story resonated with you the way it did with us, we'd appreciate you taking a moment to like this video. It helps us continue sharing these forgotten chapters from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. We'd love to hear from you as well. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Our community stretches from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.